Wednesday,
Here we are.
October 13th, 2021. Here we are.
Right, episode 239, which is kind of a cool number, right? So you have 2 and 3, and then 3 cubed is 9.
Yeah,
That's kind of a nice number.
It's not in my top 10 number list, but
no.
But
now 240, that seems like a good number.
Not as good as 420.
That's right.
We should. I'm Ash Van Steenhoek. I direct the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct Micah, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. And we are starting to talk about a formational issue.
Yes, socialized.
Yes.
So the idea of this is a big topic we've touched on before, like formation, how does it work, but specifically around issues around gender. Like, what is gender? Are you socialized male, socialized female? That ties into this whole issue about TERFs. There's a Dave Chappelle special that's getting all the attention right now. Right. I'm trans, but it's not like Dan and I are gender experts, but we have thoughts about it. And in the bigger question, and like we're looking at this from a formation perspective, that's kind of our area. But it raises all sorts of things, like how we even understand this stuff. And it's a hot topic right now. So
it is.
Why not discuss it while people are discussing it?
Or disgusting it one way or the other.
Disgusting it, yes.
All right. Well, and maybe you just mentioned an acronym that maybe we should define.
TERF is that it's like fake grass.
Yeah, it's that fake grass stuff that you get nasty burns on or something.
It's like carpeting.
Yeah.
No, TERF is TERF means trans exclusionary radical feminist. And so these days when it comes up, it used to mean like the previous wave of feminism was such that or one of the previous waves of feminism, there was a strong emphasis on femininity as this kind of embodied thing. And so when trans people became part of the awareness of the feminist movement, there was like this divide. Those radical feminists who believed in like the way in which males oppress them saw trans women as males who are like posers trying to invade upon feminine space. And others were like, no, they're maybe not the same kind of being a woman, but they're a woman in their own way or feminine in their own way. And so they should be part of the movement. And so the kind of the divide is the trans exclusionary radical feminists versus the trans inclusionary radical feminists. But of course, TERF has become like almost seen as a slur to some people because it's something you call those type of feminists. And the most famous among them is J.K. Rowling, who just thinks that since gender is just a construct, all we have is biological sex, and trans women are not women. So that's kind of the background. So Dave Chappelle is in a special this week where he's like, I'm on Team TERF. And you can say he maybe was being nuanced about that or being straightforward, but that's part of the debate that's happening.
Yeah. And I don't know. A lot of people like Dave Chappelle, and honestly, I'm not sure why.
I think he's funny and insightful, and I've always liked him, but I also think he's not some sort of like walking saint.
Yeah.
I can say I think he's funny and fuck him at the same time. I could do both of those things.
So. Yeah. And I've actually never found him to be incredibly funny. There's something that has just felt off about him. And I have kept trying every once in a while because all these people that I think like him. But anyway, so as we were talking about before the show, this idea of formation is very complicated, and either people want to make it simple or people want to pretend that formation kind of doesn't exist, right? That I don't know, somehow you come all ready to go, like sort of stamped like out of some kind of stamping machine. And Yeah, and there are just these templates that everybody goes by sort of automatically, and that it doesn't have anything to do with, one's experience and one's culture and all the different things that happen to you. But really, that's nonsense. We are formed in all kinds of different ways, and part of the complexity of it is that it's not just right that we're this, tabula rasa that is then imprinted with all this stuff, right? And that quote forms us. But formation happens relate as a relationship, right? We're relating to the outside world and we're relating to ourselves. And so formation isn't just about what happens to us sort of positively, but formation is also about, like, if we don't fit in somehow, what happens to us in our formation as we're interacting with the dominant culture and with different forms of oppression. So it's an incredibly complicated thing, and this idea that there is just one type of formation, right? Like male formation or female formation, is really just an attempt to way simplify what's going on.
Well, and it gets into the problem of, I mean, so there's so many weeds in this discussion. Like, so the issue of identity politics. So, I mean, you can't start talking about this without talking about that. This is, to me, where identity politics comes in, where people want to understand the ways in which the way I show up in the world interact with other people's way of showing up in the world, right? So, like, at the most basic level, it's like, okay, we all have a social location. We're white. That means certain things. We access this system in a way that white people do, in ways that are different than the way black people do, and so that shapes who I am, and blah blah blah. And so it gets very complicated. But what one people do, people want to do with the intersectionality stuff about how these different identities intersect, is they want to collapse it down. So,
right.
And this is where people rightfully reject, like, this idea, like, okay, what is white privilege? It's like, well, we need to recognize that there's something about whiteness that's toxic, that gives certain people privileges in society and other people don't have. Okay. But it doesn't mean that every white person experiences whiteness exactly the same way. That's where it gets collapsed down.
Right.
And when you get into a conversation among people of color who are complaining about the toxicity of whiteness, and then a white person comes in, they might want to react and say, not all white people, because and somehow in that moment, that white person feels a waves of nuance that they might not feel in other areas. And so it gets really complicated real fast, because
right.
we are all individuals, yes, but we're all within a system that ascribes certain roles to us. That's also true. And so when you start deviating from the script, which every human being does at some level, it gets messy as fuck.
Yeah. All right. We got a couple comments.
Ms. Danger asks, what are their pronouns? Ash says, you got it right in the first one. They, them.
They, them.
Yeah. Susan. Good morning, Susan. Wednesday's usually our slowest day anyways, but especially when we skip a Monday, which we did this week. So we're grateful for whatever comments we get today.
Yes.
Please bring
Although
them.
last week was also a Wednesday only week, and actually it was pretty lively on Wednesday. So,
okay.
See, stereotypes just aren't always true.
Wednesday privilege. Susan writes, the heated comments defending or objecting to Dave Chappelle, that or the District of Columbia, one of those two, is eye-opening. Or Detective Comics, I guess that's what DC stands for.
Yeah, DC Comics. Yeah.
Detective Comics is eye-opening. It has been disappointing and starting to get exhausting for me. I don't plan to watch or pay him any celebrity attention. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't. And if you try to enter the whole discussion, my current take on it. Well, I mean, you're right. It's fraught. And partly
Yeah.
because I think he's more nuanced than he's coming off, which is ironic because his whole reason for walking away from comedy for a decade is because he realized people weren't taking jokes at the nuance level he was giving them. Yet now he's doing the same thing with the trans community. And I appreciate it. Like, I actually don't feel like people should weigh in if they don't want to, but I feel kind of like I have to. This is one of the things about, oh, I guess because I'm a new trans, and for some people, I'm the only trans person they know well. I've been bombarded as shit by this stuff. Like, people ask me to weigh in and everything as though I'm some sort of like gender priest. So
Yeah.
this is,
But I think that also this damned if you do and damned if you don't experience, which is certainly a very common experience within all kinds of social political discussions, to me is a reflection of what we're talking about in terms of this wanting to collapse everything into a simple narrative, right? And so that you if there isn't any nuance allowed, if there isn't any conversation allowed, if there isn't any interaction between particular individuals and social systems kinds of reflection allowed, then that's where you get the damned if you do and damned if you don't, right? And I think that in some ways it's like that's a symptom, right? We're noticing something important, right? Which is that it's almost impossible to have nuanced conversation about these kinds of things. And I think that in the same way reflects our lack of understanding about formation.
well,
Right? Because when we say something like male formation, well, I can certainly tell you that my formation as a male, being exceptionally bright, being skipped ahead in school, being younger than everybody that I was around, being beat up and bullied all the time, my formation was very different than the formation of, the guy who ended up as the quarterback on the high school football team. Those were not the same formations. and so, to say that there's one formation or one right answer or one response to Dave Chappelle is part of the problem that we're up against.
no, and this is the tricky thing. I'm just going to make it all complicated. Is most people don't know all their intentions. So what happens is, you're in a conversation, and this is where it gets really dicey real fast. You kind of get a sense like people want to add nuance at an intellectual, dispassionate level in ways that are not in good faith. So when you try to have a nuanced conversation, sometimes it's with a bunch of dude bros who are like, I think there's a lot to this thing about gender formation, and just to play devil's advocate, like people blog it, right? So it's like, okay, well, nuance can be what is a vulnerable nuance versus one that's intellectually masturbatory, and it gets really complicated. And a lot of people, they don't feel an investment in this, and so it is all academic. And so they look at this and they think Dave Chappelle's funny. He's a black man. You might disagree with the funny part, but we both agree he's a black man. And so, like, if you're a cishet white person watching, like, well, I don't want to weigh in on that because, like, the trans community versus the black community, like, who has more oppression points? And, like, I don't want to weigh in and offend anybody. It's like, and it gets really dicey. Like, how do we talk about this? Well, part of whiteness is if you're not experiencing any kind of oppression, you can just step out of it and then not deal with the fact that, like, listen, there are people listening who are probably fairly progressive, who probably think worse thoughts about trans people than Dave Chappelle. So I don't want to scapegoat him because he's famous. Like, he might be saying the sorts of things a lot of people think. And so just canceling him, using that, which is another whole big conversation, to me is not necessarily helpful in and of itself. At the same time, I'm not really worried about a millionaire who's clearly has a number 3 Netflix special where it's almost a lot of it's talking about gender, and he's clearly not being canceled. So let's not feel sympathy.
Right. Right. Doesn't he start off the special saying, "I'm rich and famous"?
Yeah, I'm rich and famous. Then he makes a
Yeah.
joke about black people beating up Asian people, and then he says it gets worse.
Right.
So like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
All right.
Ellen's
Get
here.
some comments. Ellen is here, and that's a good thing.
Good morning, Ellen. Victoria says, good morning from Victoria and Christopher. Good morning.
Hello.
This reminds me of the worst joke in the world, the aristocrats. Everyone can Google that if they want to know the aristocrats joke. We're not going to do that. Yeah. Michelle likes the, I'm assuming
being
that's
a gender priest.
Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe that can be my new YouTube handle. Susan writes, or you're dealing with pseudo Facebook character that isn't even a real person, just to stir the pot with that joke. No, that's the other thing. Like,
yeah,
part of the challenge, like, I don't want to dump on social media. Obviously, it's meaningful. We're like on social media right now, broadcasting stuff, and so there's points to it. But the problem is, we have a loss of deep community, and a lot of because of the nature of capitalism and imperialism, what dissolves communities. We're in a pandemic that intensifies the dissolution of communities. And so people are turning to social media to maintain a sense of community, which is the worst form of deep, vulnerable conversation. So this is not the best context for having these deep conversations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that the places like church, which to me are one of the best places, kind of fucking suck at it. Especially around gender. Like, so I've been involved in all kinds of conversations around gender where people act all offended that I take issue with them being unwilling to have a statement of affirmation about LGBTQ people. And they think, well, that just ruins the nuance. I'm like, I'm not interested in having a nuanced conversation about whether or not I should be included or not. Yeah. It gets into complexity. Yeah. Go ahead. Catherine writes, haha, the caption just read you as if you're an asshat white person.
Okay. I guess
cishet white person as asshat white person. I like that. I affirm that.
That's nice.
That adds nuance.
That does.
Matthew writes, unfortunately I have to go, but thank you, Ash and Daniel. Well,
you're welcome.
People can always watch this after the fact. They live on Facebook, but they're also chronicled on YouTube under the Center for Prophetic Imagination YouTube page. Ms. Danger writes, yeah, as a trans person, it's very hard to have a nuanced conversation with some cis people on gender and transphobia. Christianity community is particularly fraught. Jesse Gender did a good video.
On Dave Chappelle.
Oh, on Dave Chappelle. Yeah, I've seen some videos out there, and and I haven't watched the whole thing. Like, we're not here to weigh in on Dave Chappelle and give the final analysis. But I do think it's important to talk about. I mean, Dan brought up this idea, like, okay, so Dan had assumptions and expectations around masculinity put on him as a child that he sucked at. Like, right? You were not able to live up to the ideal.
Right.
And so were you formed as male? Well, yes, but that's just a too simplistic way of thinking about it. And usually the way it comes up in your case, it's used to like assume your angle. But so for me, like 2 months ago, we would have both thought of ourselves as cishet white men doing a show. And then I came out, and then all of a sudden, like, well, at best to some people, I'm a kind of proto woman, right? And largely it's because of how I had 45 years of male formation. So what that means to people is that all the bad things about men live entirely within me in the same way. And so therefore, any kind of way I would speak about femininity is wrong. Now, I'm not going to somehow say that 45 years of presenting and living as a failed man, like in the same way that you had experiences where like, well, I'm not really living up to the masculine ideal, like same, but different ways, right? And a lot of men experience that. And you're not sitting there wearing the wig and makeup. Mm-hmm. So did I just decide to escape masculinity and try to commit myself to cosplaying as a woman to escape the burden of manhood. Like, there's all sorts of ways that people want to look at this.
Mhm.
And all of it tends to want to somehow reduce it down for very valid reasons. If we believe that there is toxic masculinity and male oppression in the world, which there is, then we want to be careful about, there has to be ways of maintaining boundaries for safety. I mean, I get that. But then it goes into these paranoid things about the fact that, so if I have to pee and I'm dressed as a woman, do I go into a men's bathroom where I could get assaulted? Or do I go into a women's bathroom where I am feared? Potentially, based on how much I pass. And the fact that somehow that becomes the conversation topic. Having penises in a woman's bathroom being the symbol of fear. If that's the center point of our nuanced conversations around gender formation, then we have a problem. If that's where it lives.
Well, but I think that example brings up one of the bottom line problems with all of this, which has to do with fear and safety, right? And so and the kind of sort of sick, twisted irony in a lot of this conversation is that the people who are wanting to maintain and assert these very separate, very clear, very solid, different types of gender identities and formations are the same people who, in many ways, are often terrified and insecure about their gender identity and formation. and part of what then gets distressed in them is this idea of fluidity, this idea of difference, this idea of change, because none of that is endemic in our culture. And so, and we could connect this with fundamentalism. We could connect this with different kinds of rigid systems of property and rigid systems of, monetary exchange and class. Right. That so much of what our world is about is trying to solidify reality into what is right and wrong and make all kinds of judgments about that. Right. And so that something like queerness or something like transness sort of explodes all of that. And then people freak the fuck out and they're terrified. And they don't know what to do or how to handle all of that. And then also anything inside themselves, which is different, right? What do they want to do with their sexuality? How do they want to behave in the bedroom? How are they relating to their own bodies, right? All of that, now comes up and floods them and they don't know what to do. And so I think that recognizing the kind of terror and the layers of judgment and the lack of self-compassion and acceptance that lies behind all of this is really, really important if we're going to get to a better place.
Catherine writes, there's so much alienation and pain to gendered formation, even for many cis people. I mean, before we go on, yes. I mean,
yes.
This part of the thing we have to grapple with, and this is something I used to talk about, and I guess I still talk about it, but in the past I've talked about it a lot, that white supremacy fucks up white people, right?
Right.
Because no one can live up to the white person ideal. I mean, unless you're a billionaire. And so we're surrounded, everyone is self-aware of a failed white person at some level, or they feel the weight of their own failure. I mean, it's because there's a script of what our society says you're supposed to be. And so the whole category of privilege means that you have easier access to that. But most of us can't live up to that. And so of course, I live as a taboo because I'm transgressing a gender boundary, and it makes even cishet, 99% straight, 99% cisgender people upset because their whole identity is tied up in being able to live into the ideal. And so I'm questioning just my existence challenges their ideal. Um, I don't understand why people are so attached to the idea. It feels like a strange abstract fantasy that there is some kind of mythological perfect binary female formation that needs to be gate kept and protected.
Yeah. Well, right. Yeah, that's exactly, what I was just talking about, is that we create these solid mythological things that then need to be kept and protected, because people are terrified of who they are, right? And we can connect this very much to the whole conversation that's happening right now about Instagram and what this does to young teenage girls, right? And the whole thing about you know hating your body and hating what you look like and starving yourself and all of these kinds of things. I mean, that's part of this supposed wonderful female formation, right? That's happening. And yeah, and there are huge problems of alienation and pain with it. But to unpack that requires safe spaces where people are compassionate and being cared for, and where there's a lot of openness, people being listened to, and allowed to explore without this heavy judgment coming down on them. And there are not a lot of those spaces in our society, which is really tragic.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Danger writes, mind you, with safe people, fuck non-affirming people. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. Like, for those of you, I mean, this has been a small level controversy in a small subset of Christianity around whether or not it is good for a church to have an affirming policy. And so a friend of mine wrote a piece that's been shared around a lot, David Fitch, about how such statements fall into the Christendom pattern of top-down declaration. That's bullshit. Because saying I mean, if during civil rights a church said, look, we will fight to make this a non-segregated space. To say that is a Christendom argument, trying to make a space as safe as possible for an oppressed group, to somehow say that's a power move, ignores the reality that there are people who experience legitimate oppression who need safe spaces. So for those of you who are listening who are Christian, in particular, who are sympathetic to this stuff but don't want to take a stand, stop being a goddamn coward and make a stand. And if you're not, then I don't want anything to do with you. I mean, that's kind of really my basic level of, I mean, there's a basic level. I mean, accepting that LGBTQ people can be vibrant members of your community, if you can't grant that level, vibrant, full members, then you can't have a nuanced conversation. In my mind, like you're kind of cut off from being able to even have a nuanced conversation. So Susan writes, I don't fear trans women in women's bathroom. I fear straight men in all gender bathrooms. No one wants to pee with straight men. Violent buggers. Like hashtag not all men, but also, but that was one of the things I realized is like, I feel, my whole life I felt afraid going into men's bathrooms. Because there is something about toxic masculinity in spaces of vulnerability that's really difficult. And I don't know if people who aren't trans women feel, or trans femme people feel that way, but I would imagine a lot of cis het men feel that way in men's bathrooms too.
Well, and where does that come from, right? That comes from, locker room experiences as you're growing up, which were not positive experiences, for those of us that were not at the top of the pecking order, so to speak. It's,
I mean, that's
the
the
different
part of the
levels
whole thing
of joke in that, but
I mean, this is a good reminder. The whole idea of this rape culture thing comes from a place of male dominance, and within masculine spaces themselves, there's an assertion of pecking order of dominance. And so I've experienced violence, some of it sexualized violence, from other dudes in spaces that are for men. So it exists within masculinity, masculine
Right.
spaces, as well
Yeah. And
as
so
when it spills over into feminine, it becomes increasingly violent the further out it goes.
yeah. And so to me, it's just another example of projection. I mean, what Susan's talking about, and people have talked about this in terms of, racial stereotypes and things like that. I mean, in our society, who are the most problematic, violent people, right? Straight white men. And those are the most problematic people. And so to then say, oh no, the problem are trans people, or the problem are black people, or the problem are Hispanic people. No, that's just a projection. The biggest problem are straight white men who are terrified of themselves and are formed in violence and a culture of dominance. Those are the people who are the biggest problem. All right,
Michelle
we're
writes,
at time. I should finish up.
yeah, and I'm assuming we'll be back on Friday to continue this conversation.
Well, we will not be back on Friday, but we could take this up again next week.
Yeah,
So we've got 2 Wednesday days.
So we're doing next Wednesday?
No. And next week is a full week.
Yeah. So, because I feel like it's important to somehow touch this into fascism. And so
yes,
we'll figure out a way to do that somehow or another, even if it's not on a Friday.
That's right.
Michelle writes, why are people so fucking afraid of change? It's the only constant, folks. Just, it's so frustrating. I mean, Dave's talked about the fear thing. And part of the weird thing about this is like, change happens. Not all it's progressive, because we've actually had, like, Berlin in 1928 was more trans affirming maybe than St. Cloud, Minnesota. You can make the argument because it was the center of progressive culture before Hitler. So we've had these kinds of ebbs and flows of different acceptance and normalcy, and the way we think. We have a really bad Protestant Puritanist hangover in the United States of America that informs all of our purity cultures. So it gets really complicated real fast. But yes, people definitely cling to these dominant scripts that even harm them, because they feel like what could come next might fuck it up worse. I mean, you see this, that explains the entirety of the Democratic Party in my mind, of this fear that maybe if we go further left on some things, it'll make things worse.
Really bad.
It's like we could pass laws that affirm certain groups of people more, or like clear away debts, but then we might end up with Lenin. Like, is kind of how the argument goes.
Even though he's dead.
Yeah. The zombie of Lenin could rule for 1,000 years. Ellen writes, isn't a huge part of turfiness just purity culture repackaged as feminism? They're chanting in unison, must keep womb intact. I mean, there's definitely a purity culture piece to it. I feel like there's a lot to your statement that could be unpacked and explored. I think it's a type of purity culture, for sure. But I wouldn't want to equate it too much with the sort of evangelical one, but I feel like there's a dissertation there, Alan. Susan writes, I have a 10:30 meeting, so I have to hop off. Thank you both for discussing this. Thanks for joining in as long as you could.
Thanks for joining
us. Series rates David Finch. It's Fitch, but I think he should change his name to David Finch. It somehow fits better. And folks like him need to step aside and not be an obstacle to full liberation. Michelle says, Series, you said it a lot nicer than I would have. Yeah, there's ways of saying step aside that are less polite. No, and this is the thing that people don't, we're nuanced conversation. People need to really own the context from which they're speaking and how what they're saying reinforces or challenges their own role and dominance in a situation. And so to have a bunch of white professors and pastors who are part of the dominant culture, middle class, trying to weigh in on trans experience in a nuanced way. And when trans people say, stop talking that way, they're like, wait a second, don't be hasty, let's be nuanced. Then they have to recognize what that's doing.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of, this is where the spiritual practice piece comes in, because self-awareness is required for true nuanced conversation. Right? And so, yeah, if we don't understand our social location, uh, yeah, we're just going to repeat the same habitual patterns that we were formed with and aren't aware of. So this is where the formation thing can become this very bizarre, uh, just kind of circling the drain problem.
Well, and it has to do with protection. Like, this is a liberationist kind of thing, and this is going to be my final thought. Like, if you think that you are the church and that you are the gatekeepers of salvation, the idea you'll feel threatened by a marginalized person saying, you need to listen to me for the sake of liberation. Okay.
Yes.
What I mean is, like, there has to be, our churches have to have this humility saying, we are in the process of liberation, and we need to look like our liberation requires listening to these trans people. Like, they might have the gospel for us, but if you think you're the gatekeeper of the gospel and you need to protect it, you've already kind of lost.
Yep.
So fuck
There
that
we go.
ecclesiology.
All right, and we will be back on Monday. Continue this and other conversations. Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate everybody who's here.
See you next week, everybody.
Bye.